I am going to be talking about the grandfather of all rare disease legislation and rare disease policy, and that would be the Orphan Drug Act.
Or the grandmother.
Or the grandmother, yes, matriarch or patriarch. So before I get into that, I just want to give just a bit of an introduction to NORD. We are a charitable nonprofit patient advocacy organization that represents all 30 million Americans with a rare disease. We actually also originated in 1983, just following the passage of the Orphan Drug Act. And for the last 33 years, we've been providing a variety of services to the rare disease community, and this is kind of just a snapshot, just a handful. Policy and regulatory advocacy, patient representation up at the FDA, NIH, Social Security Administration, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and on. Educational services, patient assistance programs, patient meetings and patient networking opportunities. We have a research grants program, as well as we're developing patient registries with our member organizations, and we have over 250 member organizations, each of which is an individual patient organization that advocates for individual disease or a disease family. So the Orphan Drug Act of 1983 originated from the stark need that the rare disease patient community was facing. Prior to the 1983, in the decade before 1983, only 10 treatments were brought to market by industry, and only about 34 orphan therapies existed before 1983. So the rare disease patient advocacy community at the time, which was pretty much just made up of a handful of rare moms, got together, saw the need, and a couple marches, a couple Hill Days, a couple episodes of the medical drama Quincy, a couple of those later, and we passed the Orphan Drug Act. On January 4th, 1983, President Reagan signed the bill into law. So, what is in the Orphan Drug Act? So first and foremost, the Orphan Drug Act lays out the process of orphan drug designation. So the first criteria that an orphan drug must meet is just the same criteria that any drug or biologic must meet. And those are contained within Section 505 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as Section 351 of the Public Health Services Act for biologics. Once the drug has completed the initial qualifications, they must then prove that they are intended to treat a rare disease or condition. The Orphan Drug Act defines that a rare disease is a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the United States. That's where that number comes from. It comes from the Orphan Drug Act. And if a drug, a prospective drug, can show that it is to treat fewer than 200,000 people and that it meets those initial qualifications, then it will receive orphan designation. And orphan designation usually happens pretty early on within the drug development process, usually within preclinical, maybe phase 1 at that status within the drug development process. And then the drug will continue along within the drug development process through different clinical trial phases, and then hopefully eventually reaching the public. So if the drug does complete all the clinical trial phases successfully and then is approved by the FDA, if it has been designated as an orphan, it will receive 7 years of exclusivity. Now, 7 years of exclusivity means that the FDA cannot approve the same drug from another company for that condition. So that drug has a 7-year monopoly on the market. Now, that 7-year exclusivity is really the holy grail of all rare disease orphan product incentives, but it's not the only thing that is within the Orphan Drug Act. There are various other very important provisions. One such example, which Dr. Rao has already spoken on today, is the Orphan Products Grant Program. The Orphan Products Grant Program is appropriated at approximately $14 million each year. We actually saw a funding boost this past year due to the omnibus agreement that was passed in December, and that actually went up to $16.5 million for the current fiscal year. This Orphan Products Grant Program has been very, very successful over the past 33 years. It has received over 1,800 applications, has reviewed 1,400 applications, funded 500 studies, and it has a pretty good success rate. 45 drugs on the market can be credited to the Orphan Products Grants Program. Another provision included within the Orphan Drug Act is the Orphan Products Board. This is kind of a coordinating board interagency coordinating board that's housed within the Department of Health and Human Services. This board is actually consulted by patients, pharmaceutical companies, others, and it's actually been dormant since the late 1980s. It was only in existence for about 5 or 6 years. I think the original format or structure of the Orphan Products Board didn't lead to its long-term success. However, it is still within the Orphan Drug Act, it is still within statute, and it may be an opportunity to increase intergovernmental coordination going forward. Finally, included within the original Orphan Drug Act is the Orphan Drug Tax Credit. And the Orphan Drug Tax Credit allows companies to claim a tax credit of up to 50% of their qualified clinical testing expenses. Not every single company who qualifies for the Orphan Drug Tax Credit takes the Orphan Drug Tax Credit. Some choose to instead take the research and development credit, but for the most part, most rare disease companies who are developing their therapies and qualify for the Orphan Drug Tax Credit do choose to take it. And the Orphan Drug Tax Credit itself is a very, very important incentive for orphan therapy development. This is a graph that's actually taken from a white paper that we published in coordination with BIO in June of 2015. And it shows, and the really important bar is the yellow one on the far left, and it shows that without the Orphan Drug Tax Credit, there would likely be 33% fewer orphan drugs on the market if the Orphan Drug Tax Credit was never in existence. And that goes forward as well. If the Orphan Drug Tax Credit was, let's say, repealed, then 33% fewer drugs for orphan conditions would be developed. One final provision to note that was added in 1992, which is also a very important incentive for orphan product development, is the exemption from user fees. We've already heard about the prescription drug user fee program at the FDA. Orphan designated products are exempt from paying user fees. And the important number here is the $2.37 million number, no small amount. That amount is actually exempt from orphan product developers. They do not have to pay that amount for their application. So I've mentioned, I think, 4 or 5 different incentives for orphan product developers, and here's kind of a timeline of where all of those play in. Once designated, a product then qualifies for the Orphan Product Grants Program. It would qualify for the Orphan Drug Tax Credit, and then later on in the process, once they've completed their clinical trials and then approved, they are exempt from the user fees that are paid upon the submission of the application, and then once they actually reach the market, the approval of the application, then they enjoy market exclusivity. So I think a big question that many people ask us is, has the Orphan Drug Act worked? And I think a very easy answer is yes. And this graph really shows it pretty well here. You can see the ODA passed in 1983, that little yellow bar, and ever since the orphan drug approvals have been increasing pretty rapidly. Missing on that graph is 2015 data. I think we've already heard there are 15 products approved in 2015, but it keeps going up. I would add one caveat, though. 450, maybe about 500 orphan therapies have been approved now, and most of which as a result of the Orphan Drug Act. And those are for a little over, around 350 to 400 diseases, but there are 7,000 rare diseases. So while the Orphan Drug Act has worked, there obviously is a lot more work that needs to be done, whether it be within the Orphan Drug Act or outside the Orphan Drug Act, a lot more work to be done for all of the rare diseases that have no treatment. So with that, I will pause and let Ron take the microphone.